Contamos con el placer de moderar el señor Peter Reuter, de la Universidad de Maryland, de Estados Unidos de América. Le otorgamos el uso de la voz, señor Reuter.
Good morning. This is a session on estimating drug markets, and I think I can confidently say we are in the golden age of doing such estimation. You will hear today about a whole variety of new sources of data that have some promise of giving us for the first time much sounder and more sophisticated estimates of various aspects of drug markets. And as sort of illustration of the sort of variety of ways in which these data sources have been used and developed, we have three speakers who come from very different settings. So our first speaker will be Bo Kilmer, a longtime friend and collaborator of mine, who is at the is head of the RAND Drug Policy Research Center, independent research organization. Our second speaker, João Matias, is from the European Monitoring Center on Drugs and Drug Abuse, which has been an international agency which has made a major impact on the quality of reporting of data on drugs in Europe. And our third presentation is from Luca Giamoni, who is an academic at in the Department of Social Sciences, a criminologist at the University of Cardiff. And as I say, you will hear about a great variety of new sources of data for estimating drug markets. First presentation will be by Bo Kilmer. At the end of each presentation, given that each is really quite distinct, we're going to set aside a small time period for asking questions specifically to that paper, questions of clarification, and then we'll leave the time for general discussion after all three papers. But then there will be this time for questions of clarification about each specific paper. Bo?
Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Peter for inviting me to be on this panel, and I want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for creating such a wonderful event. For the next 15 minutes, I'd like to cover two different aspects of estimating drug market expenditures. One, I want to talk about what we can learn from doing web surveys. I then also want to talk about what we can learn from respondent-driven sampling. Now, these insights are based on a number of collaborations, most with John Calkins, many with Peter, also with a number of my colleagues at RAND, and also with several graduate students at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. Now, stepping back, why do we want to measure the size of drug markets, and especially when we're talking about expenditures? Well, having a sense of scale is important when thinking about revenues that are being generated by the traffickers, and also some of the other harms associated with illicit markets. But we also want a sense of precision. We also want to be able to say over time whether or not these markets are getting smaller or whether or not they're getting bigger, perhaps in response to a policy change. And also we want to know more about estimating drug market expenditures, because it can be quite useful for making projections about legal changes. And I'll give you a couple examples from different projects that we've been doing in the States with respect to cannabis legalization. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can estimate the size of illicit drug markets. You can think about having two general categories, one being on the supply side, and then the other category being demand. Today, I'm only going to talk about demand side estimates. And one approach on the demand side is simply to multiply the total grams consumed by the price per gram. Now, that's much easier said than done. I mean, estimating the total amount consumed can be quite difficult, especially when you're talking about substances other than cannabis. That said, João is going to be giving a fascinating presentation about what we can learn from doing wastewater analysis. I think that can be a quite useful way of being able to generate these consumption estimates. But when you're doing this type of demand-side calculation for expenditures, you also have to be very careful about the information you use about price. For example, even if you know the total number of metric tons or total grams of cannabis consumed, you don't want to just multiply that by the average price per gram, right? Because you have to take into account quantity discounts. For example, in the United States, a typical purchase is about a half an ounce, about 14 grams. So if you were to use that, the price you pay per gram from that amount, it's going to tend to be much lower than what you would get for an average gram. So you need to account for these quantity discounts. And when we think about this with respect to cocaine and methamphetamine and heroin, what we really want to capture is the average price paid per a pure gram purchased, which is very different than what you might see the estimates in terms of what the price per gram would be kind of in the back of the World Drug Report. And ideally, both of these measures would be adjusted for potency. And this is even quite important for cannabis, because now with legalization in the United States, we're seeing that an increasing share of the consumption is not of the flower product. It's of the extracts, the waxes. And so ideally, when you're doing these calculations, you want to, at least for cannabis, you now want to begin thinking about the price paid for THC. Another approach would be multiplying the number of users by the amount spent per user. Now, unfortunately, most surveys don't ask about spending. But if you were going to be making changes to your general population survey, I would recommend adding 2 questions. One, add a question about how much was spent during the last transaction. And then the second question I would ask was how many of those transactions you had in the past month. It turns out we can actually learn quite a bit just from those 2 questions alone. And you would also want to be able to capture this information by the type of user, because we know that the frequent users end up consuming more per use day than your less frequent users. But of course, this is hard to get, especially when we're talking about substances other than cannabis. So there are pros and cons with each of these approaches. So with respect to generating new insights for web surveys, I think one thing to keep in mind is that it's the frequent users that dominate the market. You know, for example, so this is based on work we did estimating the size of various illicit markets in the United States for 2010. And just focus on this column here on the far left. So we estimated for 2010 that Americans spent about $40 billion a year on cannabis. But that gray bar represents how much was actually spent by those who are daily to near daily users. And you can see it's those individuals who account for about 20% of 20% of the market. They account for about 80% of all of the expenditures. And if you look at it for heroin, it's the same thing. So when you're beginning to estimate markets, that's the population you really want to focus on. And also, if you're going to be generating these estimates based on information from general population surveys, you have to be very careful about the data about those inferences, especially when you're talking about drugs other than cannabis. For example, we did, using the general population survey in the United States, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, for 2010, if you were to use that survey, you would estimate that there were only 60,000 daily or near daily heroin users in the US. But our more advanced analysis suggests that that actual figure was closer to 1 million. So this is also important because a lot of the information you're hearing about heroin markets in the United States is actually based on those general population surveys. So John Calkins and Peter Reuter and Greg Majette have a paper coming out all about that. So you want to be careful when you're using the general population surveys when you're talking about especially substances other than cannabis. As I said, one example of how we were able to use web surveys was in 2012, Washington State, that's when the voters passed the initiative to legalize cannabis. And soon after, the state of Washington wanted to know, well, how much cannabis is actually consumed in the state, so they can make accurate projections about tax revenues, get a better understanding of how many stores they should allow. Well, using the general population survey, we could get information about the total number of users, the total number of use days. Yes, we know that people sometimes misreport on these surveys, so we had to make some adjustments for that. But even when you know about the total amount, the total number of use days, you need to still know how much is actually being consumed per use day. And in fact, our general population survey doesn't ask about that. So what we ended up doing was fielding a web survey, trying to get this information. Now our goal, we only had a couple of months. You know, we knew that this wasn't going to be representative. But our idea was, the plan was, if we could get information from a couple thousand heavy, daily or near daily users, that would at least help us come up with an appropriate range for daily consumption that we could then put into the models. So in addition to asking people about the amount that they consumed, we also had a number of prompts. So we would show them a picture of an unrolled joint with uncrushed buds next to a coin and say, for example, this is a picture of a gram. On a typical day, did you consume about this amount, twice this amount, half this amount? We'd randomly assign the amount of marijuana in the pictures. So we were able to do that, and also in terms of for consistency, we asked about this in a number of different ways. It allowed us to come up with a range that we thought was appropriate. So for the daily to near daily users in the United States, they would typically use between 1.3 and 2 grams per day, somewhere around 1.6. Now, while these web surveys can yield useful insights, there are also many drawbacks. It's unclear about the population that's covered, especially when it's a convenient sample with no incentives. It's hard to detect repeat responders. Yes, you can collect information about people's IP addresses, but at least in the States, a lot of the institutional review boards won't allow you to do that. And also, you want to be able to give the respondents a sense of anonymity, so we prefer not to collect that. You also have to account for the fact that sometimes the respondents may give the wrong responses. But that's true for any type of survey, not just for web-based surveys. So in terms of some ideas for those that are thinking about doing this, one thing you can do is you can pay attention to how much time people spend on the survey. That's one nice thing about a web survey. So if you think it's supposed to take about 10 minutes and you saw that someone completed it in 3 minutes, you might want to be suspicious of the information that they submitted. And as I said, for your key questions, you want to ask about this in multiple ways, and then you can check the consistency across those different responses to make sure that they're generally similar. As I said, we asked questions about quantities consumed, but then we also had the picture prompts later in the survey. And one thing that we've learned is that, especially when you're trying to use this information to apply it to the general population surveys, is it's really important to make sure that you're getting information about gender and age. And when we first did this, we used to put those particular questions near the end of the survey. But it turns out a lot of people don't necessarily complete the survey. So one of the things that we're doing now is we're actually putting because they're so important, we're putting the questions about age and gender up front. But of course, here we've largely been talking about convenience samples, and what we would prefer is to get something closer to a representative sample of our frequent users. And so, it's fairly common for people to use snowball sampling, but we know that that's not necessarily representative. So we do know that with respondent-driven sampling, which is kind of a variant, or you could think about it as snowball sampling on steroids. But that under certain circumstances, this respondent-driven sampling, this RDS, it can generate unbiased population estimates for hidden populations. So essentially, the recruitment starts with a seed. So you find a couple seeds in a particular community, and then you not only pay that individual for, to complete the survey, you then ask them to distribute coupons to other members of their network. And so the seeds recruit, and then the recruiters recruit others, and so on. So you may think that, well, that sure sounds a heck of a lot like snowball sampling, but there are some important differences here. First of all, you're asking the individuals detailed questions about their user networks, and and what share of their friends and family members are also part of this network. For example, if we were focusing on heroin users, how many of them also used heroin? You're also doing follow-up surveys with those who do the recruiting to learn more about, yes, they may have given out 3 of these coupons, but did it turn out that 6 of their colleagues actually said no, that they didn't want to participate? So there's a lot of information you get from these follow-up surveys. There's also elaborate weighting that you have to incorporate. And so when you're doing respondent-driven sampling, it's not as if you collect all the data and then you generate one weight that you apply to the entire population or to the entire data set. You actually have to calculate different weights or separate weights for each individual question. And of course, there are a number of different assumptions that you need to assess with respondent-driven sampling. Most importantly, that the individuals that are recruiting, that they know each other. If they're strangers, that could be an important violation. You also need to make sure that the respondents can accurately tell you the number of individuals in their network who also belong to the population. So this is something we kind of do at the beginning, but then after they recruit their friends and then they come back for the money, we then give them another survey and we can ask them the same question again to make sure you're kind of getting similar responses. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so So respondent-driven sampling has been used for a couple decades now to help us get information about illicit drug users and also illicit drug markets. And in fact, we were evaluating a small drug market intervention in a city in the United States, and we wanted to get information from everyone, from all of the heavy drug users who were in that population. So we actually used respondent-driven sampling to get insights about the effects of that intervention. And with that same project, we were also estimated that total cocaine expenditures were, for this region were double that compared to what you would get from just information on individuals who had either been arrested or in treatment in the past year. And this is quite an important insight because oftentimes and in many places when we want to get information about heavy users, we'll go to arrestees or we'll go to the treatment populations because it's easy to get access to those individuals. But what this is suggesting is that by only getting individuals who have recently been in treatment or been arrested, that you're going to miss a sizable share of this market. Now, something else that we realized is when we were, after kind of applying the appropriate weights, is that if we only looked at the arrestees in this small population, in essence, if we tripled the size of their expenditures, you would get close to what the total amount of spending was, suggesting that those who were arrested in the past in the past year, only account for a third of total expenditures. Now, using a very different approach, this is from the slide I showed earlier where we're estimating the total size of the market, where we are estimating how many users there were in the United States. But if we actually kind of backed out what share of the individuals we estimated had been arrested in the past month, you would actually apply a similar multiplier. Whereas before the multiplier was 2.5 to 3 for the respondent-driven sampling method, using this other method, the multiplier would have been about 2.6. Now, this may just be a coincidence, and given that we over-incarcerate in the United States or we over-arrest, it may not necessarily be applicable to other countries. But we thought this was a convenient coincidence nonetheless, since it really is hard to actually validate these types of inferences. I also want to make it clear that there are a number of other instances where respondent-driven sampling is being used. For example, in Uruguay, to evaluate cannabis legalization there, Fernanda Boide and Rosario Quiero, both in Montevideo, have actually they're using respondent-driven sampling to get information on kind of frequent cannabis users in Montevideo, so they can learn about how the policy change affects their consumption patterns and kind of where they're making purchases. And so they've already fielded the first wave of this. And so their plan is then to follow up. So it's going to be respondent-driven sampling kind of almost as a panel, which I think there's going to be a lot to learn from. So if you're interested in this, they've got this great paper in the International Journal of Drug Policy that was published in 2016. There's also a fair amount of work that's being done in trying to combine insights from respondent-driven sampling with what you can do on the internet. So, when we were doing this work before, it was all face-to-face interviews with individuals and the members they recruited. But there's actually a fair amount of work that's being done trying to do this all on the internet. And it's slightly different from regular RDS approaches, but if it works, this could be a much cheaper way of kind of getting this kind of information. And as I said, when it comes to respondent-driven sampling, there are important limits and there are important critiques. And so for those of you who are kind of interested in this area, Doug Heckathorn, who invented this approach, and one of his colleagues, they've got a new paper in the Annual Review of Sociology, which was just published last year, which is it's a nice primer, but it also talks about some of the limitations of this approach. So in terms of my final thoughts, as Peter alluded to, given that we're in this environment where there tends to be, or where there's much more discussion about policy change, I think there's going to be more need for data and there's going to be more interest in collecting information about total drug market expenditures. As I said, I think there are many opportunities for doing this, especially in Latin America, but I also want to make it clear that just improving these market estimates, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend a large amount of money in creating these new data systems. For example, maybe just adding a couple questions to the general population survey, or maybe using some of these web surveys, which are fairly inexpensive, as a way to get better information about consumption, at least amongst our heavy users. It can be quite useful for improving the estimates and thus improving the discussion. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Are there any questions specifically questions of clarification for Bo? Please. Did I see someone at the back? No. Any hand up? Thank you.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, Enrico Bisogno from UNODC. Just a question on the market, because, okay, this is at the end of what we are talking about. So I understand that your approach, it's always a demand-based approach, whether it's the user or the consumption, but we are always talking about the final quantity quantities of drugs that are consumed. But in terms of markets, what is the idea behind that? There is a single provider giving, supplying drugs for all consumers, or it's something a little bit more complicated than that? Because of course, when we are talking about estimating the size of a market, we should take into account that markets are very much very complex. So if you can elaborate on that, what is the model behind this? The estimation of the size of the market.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, no, that's a great question. And I was specifically talking about if we were estimating the total amount consumed or spent for a specific geographic entity, whether it be a state or the US. But you raised an interesting point about, and so there are a couple different ways of getting at this. I only focused this presentation on the demand side, but there are also supply side approaches where you can use information from seizures as well as information about production. It requires making a number of assumptions, just like you do on the demand side. But if you know that the market is only supplied by kind of one entity, then that makes it a lot easier to do kind of the supply side work. For example, some of the work that John Calkins and his students have been doing now up in Washington State. So, I showed you those demand side, or kind of what we're learning on the demand side, but we now have information about how much is actually being sold legally in the country, or I'm sorry, legally within the state, which allows us to make some comparisons. So I think the approach that you would want to use is going to depend on which country you're talking about, but also the number of suppliers, where I think it's a lot easier to get information on the supply side if there's only one or two suppliers, as compared to, for example, with cannabis, where you would have a number of different suppliers. So that was a very good question. Thank you.
Enrico, thank you very much for breaking the ice. Good. Marcello.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a brief question. How do you adjust for purity when from the demand side? What are the estimates that, because the user cannot tell you what's the purity?
Exactly. So it's going to depend on the substance. So when we're, at least within the United States, when we're trying to get information about the purity adjusted prices, what we end up doing is using information from the DEA, which not only collects information on seizures, but also undercover buys. And then we've developed some algorithms that help us kind of figure out what we think the average price, or what the purity adjusted price would be. With cannabis, it's getting to be a bit different now. Because in the jurisdictions that are legalizing, they're requiring there being labels on the packages that have information about the THC and CBD contents. Now there's a whole debate about how accurate that is, but at that point the consumers know much more, at least what's on the packages. So for cannabis now, I think it's going to be easier, at least in the jurisdictions that have legalized. But no, you raise a really good point, especially with respect to with cannabis and outside of the states that have legalized. This is important because typically what we've always done is we've talked about the price per gram, just for the weight of the actual cannabis product. But as we're seeing the change in the number of products, and we're moving away from just people kind of either smoking or vaporizing the flower product, we actually would like to begin collecting more information on price per unit of THC. So that's actually something we're doing with the state of Washington. It's interesting. They collect information from seed to sale of every single plant. They follow it all the way through the supply chain, every transaction to retail sale. So you have information on the prices as well as the THC, the reported THC content and CBD content. So what we're doing now is we're doing some assessments, not only looking at how there have been changes in the price per unit of THC for the flower products, but also for the other products, the edibles, and so, yeah. So I think that's where we're going to be going with respect to cannabis.
Thank you for the questions. And our second speaker is João Matias from the EMCDDA.
So, good morning. Thank you, Peter, for putting this panel together, and also for Salome and colleagues for the invitation for the MCDDA to be here presenting our work for the last 2 decades on measuring drug use in Europe, and the work we do and how it has been changing in the last 2 decades. And also personally, for me, I'm happy to be here because I'm looking at Enrico. It's good to see old colleagues from UNODC. So for the ones that do not know the EMCDDA, so the EU Drugs Agency so well, we belong to the European Commission. We are one of the agencies, decentralized agencies. We do not work in Brussels. We are based in Lisbon. We work mainly on with illicit drugs, so we do not cover in our mandates alcohol and tobacco. We have 30 focal points at national level, the 28 member states, plus Norway and Turkey, and they are responsible for sending us data on a yearly basis. We have some standardized methodologies developed over the last 2 decades. So this is the backbone of what we do. We have 5 key health epidemiological indicators on drug use, treatment, mortality, problematic drug use and infectious diseases, and this has been our core monitoring, and I will explain you why we need new ones. In the last 2 decades, we have also developed some supply-based indicators, and also we started evaluating interventions like prevention campaigns. So why do we do this? Why do we do drug monitoring at EU level? Because it's our mandate. We need to see what's happening in terms of drug use, in drug use consequences, and to better respond to those. We have established monitoring tools, prevalence surveys, mortality registries, treatment data, but we need new ones. We have developed this in the 80s, in the 90s. We have been established for more than 20 years, and the drug situation has changed completely. Are monitoring tools still fit for purpose? We doubt, pretty much, because there are no perfect methods. There are big gaps in our knowledge. The reliability of general population surveys, we all lie in our daily lives, so people replying to surveys also do the same. At European level, because there is a long tradition of surveys, we have been seeing that the response rates are going down. There may be some survey fatigue of people replying to surveys, and one thing that is recent, sometimes people who use drugs may not know what they are using because of the emergence of what we call NPS, new psychoactive substances. Sometimes people think they are using something and they are using something else. And this also reflects afterwards on how they report this. There is an increased globalized drug market with internet playing a big role on this, and the constant appearance of new substances plays an immense challenge on how to adapt our questionnaires when collecting data on drug use. So what do we consider as new complementary tools or new methods of data collection? And we put between brackets new because some of them are not that new, and I will talk a bit about those in the coming minutes. So wastewater-based epidemiology, hospital emergency data, web surveys that Bo kindly already made my life easy by addressing it quite extensively, and the transporter studies. We always tell a story about how do we see drug monitoring in Europe. We always use a fairy tale from India that where an Indian king asked all 10 of his employees to go in a closed room without lights, and he put an elephant inside the room, and he asked each one of the 10 to touch and to describe what they were, what was the object inside the room, and each one of them described a different thing because there were no lights. And this is what happens a bit with drug monitoring. If we only look about surveys will tell us one story. If we look about mortality, it will tell us a different story. So we have to have a combined view, what we call a helicopter view. What has been changing in the last 2 decades in Europe? Fortunately, heroin use and injection of opiates declined in Europe over the last 2 decades. Also, the rates of HIV have declined. There are different national stimulant markets in Europe, in 30 different countries. There seems to be more polydrug consumption behaviors. The emergence of NPS has played a role not only in monitoring but also establishing interventions. And there's been treatment expansion. And also the recent changes in the cannabis market in the US may play a role also what we are seeing in Europe. So this just to say that the monitoring system has been implemented 20 years ago in a completely different situation, and that's why we need to adapt our monitoring tools. For those of you into movies, we always do this parallel. Trainspotting, the first one in the 90s, describing a very chaotic situation in terms of drug use, with young people using and injecting drugs, socially excluded, and 20 years after, they did Trainspotting 2 with a more completely different situation, with an aging group of people. They still use drugs, socially included, not so much injecting. And this reflects quite well the situation in Europe and how it has changed. Bo mentioned it before. One of the methods that we have been developing together with the SCORE network is what we call the wastewater analysis. And how does this work? Bluntly, it's, as the image shows, it's a huge pool of urine. Basically, as a human, all that we eat, smoke, inject, after it's inside your body, is transformed, is metabolized, and once you excrete it to the sewage system, there are some researchers, I'm happy not to do that, go to the treatment plants and collect samples of untreated water to look for the metabolites that the body excretes after using illicit drugs. So this is done for cocaine, for all the drugs, with some limitations in some of them. So basically, this is how it works. This has started in 2011. We have an increasing number of cities involved. This is city-level data, not national, as the national population, traditional population surveys. Some findings. This data has not yet been published. We'll be publishing our European drug report in 2 days. So these are the 2007 findings on cocaine. So basically are the cocaine metabolites that were found in water treatment plants. And for us it was quite surprisingly, because the data from our traditional tools was not showing an increase in cocaine use, although we were seeing more people arriving to treatment, more people going to emergencies because of cocaine, but our traditional surveys were not showing an increase in use. But with the wastewater data, we were able to detect this increase in the last 2 years. An additional component that wastewater allows us to see is a temporal variation. So for example, it's not a big surprise, but we see that, so on the left side you have the ecstasy daily trends. So we have Tuesday to Monday, and we see that the ecstasy use is more concentrated during the weekend, which is no big surprise because it's mainly recreational use. But now we have a way to quantify this. On the right side, you have the trends, the daily trends for cocaine. I'm not showing here, but for example, for amphetamine and methamphetamine, the pattern is completely different. So the increase is not seen during the weekend because it's a more problematic drug use population, so the use is more constant throughout the week. As all the methods, this has strengths and limitations. This is not the Pandora, this is not the best method ever. It has a big advantage that is not subject to response bias. It allows to identify truly the substances that have been used, and it has timely information. On the other hand, it does not give us any numbers of how many people are using a specific substance. It's city data versus national. And there are also some ethical issues if one should use this in prisons, in schools. Quick story. In Australia, they decided to apply wastewater analysis in a neighborhood that they already knew there was a lot of crime and drug use. So, surprise, they did wastewater analysis, they found a lot of drugs in the system, and they implemented more repressive measures. So this was one of the bad examples on how wastewater has been applied in the past, but we have developed some ethical guidelines on that are published on our website. A second data source that we have now developed, we have in epidemiology, we call a Sentinel System. So we have hospitals throughout Europe that do collect data on emergency cases, that people that arrive to an emergency department because of a drug issue, and they record what are the reasons and the socio-demographic characteristics of those arriving there. Also, no big surprise, heroin is the main reason for people arriving for an emergency because of drug use. In most cases, alcohol is also involved. One thing that we saw is that hospitals closer to recreational settings, like discos or bars, the proportion of stimulants like ecstasy, cocaine, was much higher than in hospitals that were not located in recreational areas. Bo already covered the web survey. We also have developed what we call the European Web Survey on Drugs. Now, for us, it's a pilot project we have done with 14 countries. We focused on questions that we do not get from our traditional general population surveys. So in this case, on amounts of drugs used. It allows to get a lot of information that we do not get from the traditional surveys. It allows for larger samples at low cost, but as I referred before to wastewater, it's not a Pandora box. It has a lot of limitations. The results are not possible to generalize to the whole population. Another set of studies, a concept that we have been developing in recent years is what we call transporter studies. This is basically a methodology using mixed methods that we try to get a lot of information on a specific topic on which we do not have anything coming from our monitoring tools. So for example, last year we did one on the use of new psychoactive substances among prisoners, and the report will be out also in 2 days. And this year we are doing one on cocaine, so to see what are the drivers behind the increase in cocaine use in Europe. Basically, we draw on mixed methods. We do a literature review. We have qualitative and quantitative interviews with experts. We call a meeting as a part of the methods with experts that we usually do not have in our networks. So, for example, in 2015, we did one on ecstasy. We brought festival organizers, doctors from emergency departments, people working in clubs. So we try to bring a lot of different expertise in order to understand what's happening. Other potential sources that we are developing at the moment, not as developed as the ones I mentioned before, we are starting also looking at open source information. So we have some IT tools that scroll the data, open websites. For example, we are looking at big cocaine seizures reported in the media, and sometimes we see that for us it's more reliable, the data we get through looking at what's available on the web than from the official sources that's sent to us. Another network that we are just developing now, and a close collaboration with, is with the drug checking people. For those who do not know, drug checking is, there are some services in Europe that occur at festivals, at nightclubs, where there is a service provided to people who plan to use drugs. So someone who has a drug already with them, they can deliver a sample to some people there doing some analysis, and then they get the results back to see what are the substance. Because At the moment, the substances are so adulterated that sometimes people think they're buying MDMA, and they are, in the end, what they have is a strong opioid or PMA that can actually kill them. So there are some services, not throughout all over Europe, but in some countries, and we are developing this also as a way of monitoring what's available on the market. On the same level, we are also developing a network with drug consumption rooms in Europe, exactly for the same reason, and we are starting to analyze studies doing air testing and saliva. So in summary, because I'm still on my time, the core monitoring, so the traditional surveys, treatment data, mortality, will still be the core of our monitoring. It relies on national data, so for us it's fundamental when we try to put together data from 30 countries, trying to understand what's happening in Europe. So we always stress we are going to keep the core monitoring as our primary source, but we need complementary tools to see what's happening at European level. All methods in all areas have strengths and weaknesses, and one has to bear in mind those when presenting the data, and one always have to try to triangulate to better know what's happening. I'll go back to the story of the elephant. That for emerging trends and to see what's happening at national level, it's fundamental that you try to combine different ways of collecting data. You have your routine monitoring with surveys, seizures data, overdoses data, but then try to combine with hospital emergencies, forensic data, internet monitoring, transporter methodology, wastewater, to see what's happening in real time. I think it was Oscar yesterday from Mexico that said that we might have the best monitoring systems in the world, we might have the best data ever, but we have always to think back that we are talking about people. We can talk about statistics, numbers, and people, but if the data that we collect, if the monitoring systems that we have do not inform better policies, they are pretty much useless. So we can spend here 3 days discussing models, but we always have to bring back people to have better informed decisions, to have healthier decisions and safer decisions. This is what I would like to finish with. Thank you.
So, questions to João? No one wants to talk about wastewater?
Enrique.
Please. The microphone is coming.
Buenos días. En los trabajos que ha mostrado usted se muestra siempre a personas mayores. ¿Existen menores de 10 años, 12, 13 años metidos en el tema de la droga?
I'll reply in English, okay? Because if I reply in Spanish, I'll make a fool of myself. Some of the surveys that we collect data on school students, so basically 15, 16-year-olds. So we do not collect data on people aged 10, 11, and 12. Obviously, that those with 15 and 16 may have started their drug use careers in an earlier age. So yes, there are some people with age 10, 11, and 12 that do use drugs, but the proportion is very, very limited. And one thing that we have been seeing over the last 10 years is that the age of initiation is increasing and it's not decreasing. So we don't have more younger people using drugs than we had before. Enrique.
Sorry to take the floor again, but on the wastewater analysis, 2 questions. One is, can we also estimate or have an understanding of quantities, or also only of trends? This is something in which would be the assumptions that are needed to make those estimations, and also if you have looked into how to extrapolate the results of cities to national level. Thank you.
the first question, there have been works now. Actually, now at the moment, a lot of people are trying to extrapolate the market size. I have to say, not a lot have been done on that. The second question on it's very difficult because it's in some of the cities you have several treatment plants that cover a part of the city, sometimes not even the whole city. So then afterwards to extrapolate from city-based to national data, it's even more difficult. I'll give you an example. In Finland, at the moment, they cover 70% of the whole population, but they are in a privileged position, so it's not yet been done to extrapolate to national level.
Thank you. I would just like to ask you, with the traditional population surveys, right in the past few years, has your group been making decisions to reduce that or to dedicate resources to other methodologies? And really, do you see a time where you may not use traditional population surveys?
The immediate response is no. We do not want, and we are not asking member states to stop doing traditional general population surveys, because those surveys are a robust, really methodology that allows us to look at patterns of drug use, which wastewater does not allow. It allows us to measure trends, because in most countries we have surveys for more than 2 decades. So clearly, no, we do not want to get rid of those. And also because they allow us to have a lot of information that we do not have from any other source. So no, we are going to continue, and we are continuing developing better ways of improving the questionnaires at European level and the comparability of data between countries.
Well, thank you very much. And now to our third speaker, Luca Giamoni. And I might say it will be about entirely different data again.
In the first presentation, both showed us how to estimate illicit markets, how to estimate the consumption of illicit drugs. But there's something that we know about illicit drugs. And this is that drugs are trafficked across many countries before reaching consumers. This means that consumption is just a part of the equation. We know this in particular about heroin and cocaine. So consumption is just a part of the equation. To this, we need to add the quantity of drug that is imported and then exported. And this is particularly important for the so-called trafficking countries. So we developed a methodology to estimate the quantity of drugs trafficked across countries. So the quantity of, in this case, heroin that is trafficked across any pairs of country. So this is the methodology, which is composed by 3 steps. And so in the first step, we identify the links, so the connections among countries. So we identify the drug trafficking network. Then we estimate the quantity. And finally, we put these 2 elements together to estimate the quantity of drug, the quantity of heroin trafficked between and each pairs of countries. The results that you're going to see in this presentation are specifically for heroin and for Europe. However, you can apply this methodology to, I think, all drugs, to any regions, and also to other trafficking, other trafficking activities, so for instance, human trafficking. Let's start with the first step. So we need to identify the connections between countries. And to do this, we use the UNODC biannual seizure report. So this dataset contains information about seizures cases. In particular, it reports information about the destination, the place where the seizure took place, and also the intended destination of the seizure. So for instance, you have a seizure of 100 kilos of heroin in Bulgaria that was coming from Turkey, and the intended destination of this shipment was Germany. With this piece of information, we're able to say that we have a connection between 3 countries and 2 connections from Turkey to Bulgaria and from Bulgaria to Germany. okay? If you do this, and you combine all these information from this data set, the result is this. Okay? It's a network. It's a network where each dot is a country, and we have the relationship between these countries. So how they are connected to each other by heroin trafficking. Then, at this point, we have just the network, okay? We need to add quantity, so we need to estimate the volume of heroin in this region in Europe. And to do this, we use a consumption-based approach, so the one that Bo has just briefly mentioned. So we start from the consumers, so we estimate consumption, we estimate seizures, and we assume, we say that for each country, they need to import the quantity consumed, the quantity seized, plus the quantity of drug that they export to other countries. Now, to summarize and to simplify this, I create a small figure to simplify this. So, in the first step, we identify the connections and also the relative relevance of each connection. Why? Because we have information about the connection, but also about the quantity. So we assume that if 60% of the seizures in the UK comes from the Netherlands, then we assume that 60% of the import in the UK comes from the Netherlands. In the second step, we need to estimate quantity, so the quantity of drug consumed and seized in each country. And in the third step, we combine these two parts together. Nope. I don't know what's happened. Okay, here we are. Sorry. Sorry about this. So you already see the presentation? I don't need to add anything else to this. So in the third step, we combine these two steps. So we have the network and the relative relevance, and we have the quantity. So for instance, country A receives 2/3 of the heroin that it needs from country C, and 1/3 from country D. So which means that it receives 10 tons, for instance, from country C, and 5 tons from country D. Here, you can see the difference between consumption and trafficking. So if you look at country C and you think just about consumption, you can say that it's not really important in terms of drugs, in terms of the volume that you have in that country. But at the same time, country C needs to import 10 more tons because then these are exported to country A. So there's a difference between consumption and trafficking. And this is basically the results of this process. If you apply this methodology to all the countries, that's the result. So you have this weighted network of the heroin trafficking to Europe. So at the beginning of the trafficking, you have Afghanistan, which is the main producer of heroin and of the heroin which is consumed in Europe. Then you have Iran, then you have Turkey. And then after this, you have these flow splits across the different countries. So you have different trafficking routes. And you can focus also on some specific countries and see the relevance, so where they export, where they import, and all these profiles for each country. And we can also look at some of the features of this network. So, for instance, this network is composed by 61 countries, so each node, each dot here is a country, and there are 187 connections. This means that overall, our network is not really dense. It's actually, what we see is that there's a concentration of drug trafficking on specific connection, on specific path. And this is particularly interesting because if drug trafficking is concentrated, probably it means there is something shaping the geographical configuration of international drug trafficking. So we thought, now we have some fancy maps, some colorful maps, and we can also but we can use this to try to understand what are the factors shaping the international configuration of drug trafficking. So we use two theories. So this network, the network that you have just seen, is going to be our dependent variable, and we are going to look at what are the factors shaping this network. So we use two main theories, the illicit enterprise theory and the social badness theory. So the illicit enterprise theory says that basically drug traffickers are just businessmen, so they're trying to maximize the profits and minimize the risk or the cost. On the other side, the social badness theory says that drug trafficking is deeply embedded into social relations. So you cannot deal with drugs, you cannot deal with heroin, cocaine like you deal with any other legal product. So you cannot hire a translator if you want to import cocaine from Peru or Colombia or any country to Europe. You cannot market your product. If something goes wrong, you cannot call the police and say, look, my shipment of heroin just disappeared. So in this context of uncertainties, friendship, coming from the same background or coming from the same community, speaking the same language are very important for facilitating the international trafficking. So we use we try to operationalize these two theories with some variables. So some variables for legal enterprise theory and some variables for the social badness theory. So for instance, in order to identify the cost for traffickers, we use seizure rate, or we use also corruption, or to identify if traffickers are following the profits, we use the trade, the wholesale price marks up. So the difference in the wholesale price between countries. And then we use also some variables to identify to operationalize the social badness theory. So we use common language and colonial relationship. So if two countries were in the same in a colonial relationship, and we also look at if two countries share a large or small migrant community. Plus, we have some variables about the geographical proximity. So if two countries share a border or the distance between these two countries. Then we use a particular methodological approach to understand how these variables affect, how these variables shape our dependent variables, so the network. I'm not going into detail of these. I'm not going into details of this methodology. The only thing that probably at this stage you need to know that we're able to understand how these variables affect the formation of a tie, so the probability of the presence or the absence of a connection between two countries, but also the volume, so the quantity of drugs traded between each pair of countries. This is methodology, and these are the results. So now we are looking at the variables that have positive influence on the formation of a tie. And in fact, what we see is that migrants, so having, if two countries share a large migrant community, it's quite likely these factors have a statistical influence in the formation of a tie. Or if two countries share a border, they are quite likely to create a connection in terms of trading drugs. And the same with corruption. So corruption facilitates the creation of a connection between two countries. Then we do the same, but in this case, it's not the presence or the absence. We're looking at the quantity, the volumes of drug traded between each pair of countries. So we say basically almost the same, that geographical proximity and social proximity facilitate the trading, and also that corruption is a factor, it's a variable that can facilitate also not just the formation of a tie, but also the quantity of drug traded between countries. So some discussion about this. Drug trafficking is not randomly distributed, it's concentrated. And there are some factors shaping the geographical configuration of this network, the structure of the international drug trafficking. And we see that social and geographical proximity are two important factors. So if two countries are socially similar, they're quite likely to trade drugs with each other, in this case heroin. And similarly, if they share a border, so if they're geographically close, it makes everything easier for the trafficker to export, import drugs. At the same time, we see that corruption is a facilitating factor of the international drug trafficking. So it seems like that in the end, illicit drugs go where it is easier for them, for traffickers. And also these are, I believe, have some practical implications, because if drug trafficking is concentrated, then law enforcement should be concentrated. Concentrated where? On those connections that we have just seen, but also on those connections that, according to these factors, are more likely to become trafficking routes. At the same time, these analysis, this methodology offers a tool to monitor, to predict, and even to respond to the so-called balloon effect. So the balloon effect says that if you increase law enforcement on a specific connection, traffickers will displace to another location, to another connection. They will create a new trafficking route. With this, we can predict where traffickers are more likely to displace, and so we can respond in time to this. So, I should say that this work would not have been possible without the data collection, without the data provided by the UNODC. So we use this drug seizure report database, which contains some very important information for us. However, I think it's still possible to improve the data collection so that we can improve our analysis. How? For instance, what we see is that we have information at country level. However, this is quite generic. We will need more precise locations. It will be much more useful for us and for law enforcement to have information at micro level. Okay, so at city level, for instance. And then it will be important to understand also the method and the mode of transportation. So what kind of vehicle they use, what kind of transportation they use between countries. So if you combine at this point information about the precise location, so we can know precisely where drugs goes, we can know how much drugs is traded and how. This will be something that it's very relevant, very important and actionable for law enforcement. At the same time, we can improve the way we track. We identify the location where drug shipments have been. So with chemical profiling, with analysis, chemical analysis, and physical analysis, and so looking at the organic composition of the shipment, so looking at the impurities of the seizures, we can understand the origin, but also where these loads, these shipments have been, so in which country they've been. And this will be very useful for us to understand, to have a better instrument to track and to understand the flows of illicit drugs. And then it would be interesting also to have information on the nationality of the people arrested, because this will give us, in this way, we'll have information about the flows, but also the people behind this trafficking. And since I have 50 seconds, so both, and we already mentioned about the importance of having data on price and purity, also to improve our analysis. And what we are trying to do now is to apply the same methodology to online drug trafficking. So there's been an explosion and diffusion of the trafficking of drugs through crypto markets. And we can use some of the digital traces left by traffickers to understand these trafficking flows. So we can do the same thing, but tracking the international drug trafficking flows through online crypto markets.
Without Enrico as the first? Well, let me ask a question then. So you're using seizure data as the measure of a flow. And the seizure data is the result of the intensity of interdiction and the scale of the underlying flow. How do you deal with variations in the intensity of interdiction?
We don't use it's easier to estimate the intensity of the flows, to estimate the volume or the quantity of drugs traded between these countries. We use Caesar just to understand the relative relevance of that specific connection. So unless law enforcement are targeting a specific connection, there shouldn't be a bias regarding the destination of the flows of these drug shipments.
Questions which I will withhold. So, someone.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask you, had mentioned, just to understand it, that you had also evaluated where there were corrupt linkages. Did I understand correctly? Is it possible to say something more about that?
So we use Transparency International Index like for the imported countries. So the probability of forming a tie refers to a connection drug trafficking route between two countries, in this case, refers to the corruption of the importing country. So it's probably the only indicators at country level about corruption. It's probably possible at some point to refine, improve the analysis. I'm not sure at this moment with this data how.
Hi, Luca. Thank you for your presentation. And I was wondering, given the fact that you use heroin, I believe, as a proxy for underlying drug markets, how it relates to the presentation given earlier by Zhao, who emphasized the decline in heroin use throughout Europe. So can we understand this heroin as a proxy for other types of drugs that may use the same route, or what are your views on that?
We can use this methodology for other drugs. At the same time, theoretically, it's possible to do a longitudinal analysis of these flows. However, I don't think we have this kind of data, so we're not able to track the flows in the last 20 years. So it's possible to see how the interaction between flows across time. It's possible with the data. I'm not sure that's something it's possible to do for us now in practice. Does that answer your question?
Any more questions specifically for Luca? In that case, we turn now from questions of clarification to anything you care to ask or any comment you care to make, provided it can be said briefly. Any takers now? No questions? Michael Levy, thank you.
Just speak loud.
No, the translator needs you.
Yeah, I mean, these three methodologies combined are very interesting. I hesitate to use the word transformative, but how far do you think that you're going to get practitioners and policymakers to take more notice of the impacts of what you're doing?
Thanks. We belong to the European Commission, so we hope that the work we do help member states to better plan drug policies and better prevention and intervention measures. Sometimes I struggle because it's difficult to see our work that we do on a daily basis to be reflected at national level. But definitely, we are seeing more and more general population surveys being referenced in national action plans on drugs as a tool to measure the impact of an intervention. The same applies to other methodologies. Mortality data being also reflected as a key performance indicator on national action plan on drugs. So you do see some impact of the methodologies that we have been working on at national level. Yeah, but I agree that sometimes it's very frustrating not to see that every day and easily represented on the data.
And I would just add, is this on? Oh, no, it's on. No, I would just add that, so I was presenting some data from Washington State from a survey that we did in 2013, and they found it quite useful. So we're actually in the process of refielding that survey right now. So actually it's going to go live next week. And the nice thing, at least about the web surveys, is that they're quite inexpensive. And so they easily could have done this, so governments could actually do this themselves. Actually, one of the things you worry about now is almost survey fatigue, because this is so cheap, and and users are inundated with these types of surveys. So that's actually, I think, going to be an important problem going forward.
Hello. Thank you. Very, very fascinating new ways to address the drug, measuring drug supply and demand. But out of all the different methodologies, I haven't heard anything about the money, following the money, the profits, the earnings of who makes the money and what he or she does with the money. Any tips of new directions of, if there are any of those?
Yeah, no, that's, you're getting into Peter's territory there, but I can say one of the things that we were able to do is, after estimating the size of these markets, we were able to, so this was about 8 years ago, when the cannabis debate was quite lively in California. And there were arguments being made that if you were to legalize cannabis in California, that it would just take away so much money from the Mexican drug trafficking organizations that there would lead to a dramatic cut in the number of homicides. And so what we were able to do is, first of all, having information about the size of the U.S. market, and also having to make some assumptions about what share of that cannabis market was supplied by Mexico versus domestic. We could then look at information about the price, and actually John showed some of this in his presentation yesterday. We could look at what are the prices on the southern part of the border, what are they selling it for, and then what are the purchases being made kind of mostly at the wholesale level. So we could begin to get an idea of, at least for the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, how much money were they making just exporting these substances to the United States. Now, we weren't trying to account for the amount of money that they made within the United States, but just kind of even using that, and this is where we relied on data from the UNODC at the wholesale level. We were able to, long story short, if you looked at all of the money that these drug trafficking organizations were making, just moving marijuana, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin across the border, of that, cannabis probably accounted for 20–25%. But at that time when we did that analysis, we just kind of lumped all of the Mexican drug trafficking organizations together. What I would love to do is do something a little bit more specific now, focusing on the different organizations and kind of looking at their portfolios. So that's one way of kind of getting at that. But a lot of that all relies on having good information about total consumption, at least in the kind of the destination country.
Okay. Does it work? Yeah. Okay, so basically we could use this methodology or expand this methodology to also estimate the money that they can make from these tracking flows, because once you have the quantities, you can also, using information about price, wholesale prices, you can also estimate the quantity, how much money they make from these trafficking flows.
If I might add something. So as part of a project that Bo led, what America's users spend on illegal drugs, produced an estimate of expenditures for cocaine, each of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and cannabis. And the range was essentially 1 to 3. That is, I think, the sort of a counterpart to a 95% confidence interval, even though it wasn't exactly that, was something like between $14 and $32 billion for cocaine. And that was not taking into account our uncertainty about 3 or 4 important parameters. And it's just a reminder that one reason to legalize drugs is the data are so much better. I mean, you know, you hear Bo talking about this, Washington State cannabis data. They have 100 million observations. They throw out 1 million here and 1 million there because they're not, exactly right. When you deal with these illegal markets, there's so much variation that you can't really capture, that these are very uncertain estimates.
Thank you all for your great presentations. My question is specifically addressed to Zhao. The transporter methodology sounds really interesting, and could you expand on that? Especially, I'm interested in about what you said about multi-method triangulation, the surveys or interviews to doctors, pubs, clubs. Do you have a way of prioritizing some recreational areas, or how do you decide where? That would be my main question.
Thanks for your question. A fundamental step in the transporter methodology is actually selecting the topic of study. So you have to have signals coming from some of your monitoring tools. So like I will use the one we are going to do this year on cocaine, where we're seeing increases in treatment, in people arriving to emergency departments, in some cases of overdoses with cocaine involved. So we saw something that was happening, but we do not know what are the drivers behind it. So that is the first step, is have signals to select your topic. Then the selection of experts and the way you collect the data, so the qualitative and quantitative questionnaires afterwards, reflect the topic of your selection. So for example, for cocaine, we will bring people, I think someone from Colombia, from the production side, some forensic people doing analysis on seizures. We will not have anyone from clubs or festivals. That we had for the MDMA one, because we saw, by doing the literature review, and because it's basically common sense, that a lot of ecstasy use occurs in recreational settings, in festivals, in clubs. So the selection of your experts depends on your topic selection. I don't know if it's clear, if I replied to your question.
Thanks. I have the question to Bo. In the surveys, the coordinates the surveys are from the person work, the survey done, where the person live, or the person buy the drug. What is the coordinates these surveys?
I'm sorry, is the question how do we field the web surveys?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
the consume surveys.
Yeah, it was very much using social media. It was very much a convenient sample. And to be quite honest, we were doing this work, we didn't have much time. And so as I said, our approach, we weren't trying to get a representative sample, but we thought that if we could get information about the amount consumed per use day from a couple thousand individuals, that was going to be enough to give us a reasonable range for our models. And so actually I'm going to pass it over to Joao to talk about this, simply because with the work that they've been doing on the European survey of drugs, web survey, they've been experimenting a lot with potentially paying for Facebook ads. So.
Yeah, so when we start developing the web survey in a specific country, we always approach the country saying you have to develop a wide variety of recruitment strategies, because the purpose of having web surveys with people who use drugs is to try to have a range of people with all the frequencies of use. That's what you do not get through general population surveys. So different countries have used different strategies, like using students' email networks and sending out emails to students from universities to fill in the survey, creating Facebook pages and groups advertising the survey, printing flyers to distribute in clubs and bars for people to know about the survey with this QR code that you can just use your mobile phone and you go straight into the survey to fill it in. And one thing that we saw that worked quite well was using Facebook paid ads and Google paid ads. So basically, you need a budget for that. You can set some ads on Facebook where you target your population. You want adults living in country X that have specific interests on music festivals, on drug X, Y, and Z. And so the Facebook ad is displayed for that target population. And we saw that that worked quite well. But mainly, obviously, we reach a young group of people, a younger group of people, because those are the ones using more Facebook, and also more recreational users. So what we also ask countries to do is to try to find ways to recruit people. Let's say people use drugs in a more problematic way. So several countries were going to low threshold surveys, to treatment centers, advertising the survey. Some countries had the possibility to have tablets in the treatment centers for people to fill it in the survey. So there are a wide variety of methods you can use to reach different types of users.
I think at this stage, hearing no more questions, should thank the panelists and move to lunch.
Muchas gracias a los panelistas y a nuestro moderador por sus interesantes aportaciones.